The parsha today is Bahar, from the mountain, and it's just one short chapter. Tomorrow we're going to deal with Bechut Kotai. Bowtie. Yes. But before we get into the Bahar itself, I want to give an overall sort of picture that's really important to examine. Now, the word Bahar is on or at or of the mountain, The idea is that, and it starts off by saying, and the Lord spoke with Moshe on the mountain of Sinai. The central theme of the story and of receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai is the actual limitations that are placed on the Israelites in their relationship to each other. And often we don't realize it, but the Ten Commandments is pretty clear. The Ten Commandments laid out a relationship with God and man, and there are limitations. And I think one of the most incredible things that we learn from universal wisdom that comes from Torah is that these general principles have flowed down through history into many different cultures and peoples and religions, etc. And if you look there, unless their societies fully corrupt, governments that are corrupt, generally human beings to each other, generally speaking, tends to operate at some level of a code, ethics, right? Even in prison, they have, what do they call that, the honor code or something like that?
Honor among thieves.
Honor among thieves. Even among thieves, there's some level of honor amongst them. And it's interesting that the Torah portion for this week deals with the sabbatical year and actually what to do on the sabbatical year, what all is to take place. And it's interesting because they are limited in place. It's about setting boundaries for the people. Exodus 19:12, we're going to go back a little bit. It says, and set boundaries for the people all around. This is the first one. What was the boundaries for Exodus 19? It was about the boundaries of those that are around the mountain. Don't come too close. This is your limitation. This is what you're supposed to do. And he says, don't even touch the edge of the mountain. So right off the bat, the creator of the universe is setting boundaries for the Israelite people. Now, you and I have learned a tremendous amount from our Torah study that this is the mark of holiness that we all carry. Every human being is that understand your place and understand you have boundaries. In a society that doesn't have boundaries, it's a society driven by anarchy. I thank God that I was walking through the airport, and that particular terminal that I was in was under construction. So when you normally have the extra long or wide walking space, there was only half of it, right? And so people were very closely trying to navigate past each other, and there's a general traffic flow. But I'm telling you, I was not 10 feet into the terminal when I began to notice people walking the wrong direction. You understand? Like, instead of walking over here, they're walking right in the middle of everybody trying to walk in the opposite direction. And I'm thinking, these are people that didn't get good home training or something, because who in their right mind actually goes against the flow and not think about it? I think that the average person goes, oh, I think I'm going against the flow, let me get in the other lane. It's what we call good social training. The God-fearing man in society understands even self-imposed limitations. We were talking about this, I think, on Thursday, about people who are atheists and agnostics. And I had a long discussion with someone the other day about this idea who says, and I remember this quote a lot from where I come from, you would not want to know me. I would be a horrible person without JC. You've heard that, right? No, you've not heard that? I have plenty of times. Like, I would be a terrible person if it wasn't for my relationship with JC. And I just recently saw that with someone who wrote it about Torah. Right? Okay, I get what they're saying. But the point is, if that's what's keeping you from being a decent person, something's not right inside. Like, the average person doesn't have a bipolar behavioral issue. Most people have a parameter of ethics and values that they live by. And whether they're Christian or not, or Jewish or Hindu, it doesn't matter. They live by a set of ethical values. Unless they've been trained in a culture that is counter to that. And we know of people that are that way. Parashat Emor was the last one, limited man's control over time. Shabbat and the holidays were called Moedi Hashem, the times of the Lord, and man must alter his daily behavior in order to bring sacrifices in the time of this mundane schedule. Everything was ordered by Hashem. Even today, prayer time for the Jewish male is very succinct and when it's done. Boundaries of man's behavior related to place, his land, his society. Man is in control of his land for how many years? 6 years. Who does the land belong to? Hashem. So what is the purpose behind the land? And we're going to talk about this in a moment. Why did Hashem say in the 7th year, you're going to let the land rest? Well, there's many explanations. One obviously is a horticultural issue. You let the land rest, it's good for the land. But it also had to do with a social requirement that says that the land that was given to an individual in his family inheritance belongs to him. And if he had to sell part of it because of debt, it needs to go back to him. So it's this essence of God, the essence of the Creator that says that the restoration of all things is very important. And that you can draw boundaries at some level out and out, but ultimately everything needs to go back to itself. It needs to go back to restoration. And that's why we understand that from the time of creation till the time that Mashiach comes, it's all about one thing, and that is about the restoring of all things. So if you can imagine 6,000 years man exists on earth, then in the 7,000th year, the captive will be made free. Those who are enslaved to their own mindsets, their own religious values, etc., will be set free. The land will have an opportunity to rejuvenate. I mean, think about the amazing transformations it starts taking in society. It's just like that when Mashiach comes. The 6 years you shall follow, in verse 25, 3-4, it says this: 6 years you shall sow your field, 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruit. But in the 7th year there will be a Shabbat of shalom, rest for the land. Leviticus 25, 3-4. The first 7 verses of the parashah describes the observance of the Shemitah, which is the sabbatical year, and come to teach that one who truly controls the land is he who created it and gave it to man, not those who settled on it or cultivate it. Liberation of the land once in 7 years makes the land a kind of a continuation of Mount Sinai with its limited access. Now think about this for a second. God says, I own the land, and this is how I'm going to prove it to you. You farm it, you take care of it 6 years. In the 7th year, I'm going to make sure that you have enough that you won't need to produce anything in the 7th year. As a matter of fact, this is one thing that says, even though your access or excess might be limited slightly, you'll be sated. You'll be satisfied with what you have. And that the Creator of the universe says, I will make sure that rain comes at the right season and right time so that the land produces in such a way that you will always have equal to the 7th year fruit, which is amazing. So the Creator is saying, this is why boundaries and limitations are important. And to prove to you, I'm going to make sure you're taken care of if you do those things. That's an incredible thing. Verse 8 onward describes the kind of society to be built in the land of Israel. The limitations placed upon it. A social economic revolution is to take place each 5th year. The poor man who has sold his inheritance plot of land is in his hour of need is to receive it back. Can you imagine? I had this discussion with someone who comes from family who was very wealthy in the UK, back in the 1600s, 1700s, right? They couldn't afford to maintain this massive estate and land that they owned, so they liquidated it, pennies on a pound, if you understand what I'm saying, and moved to the Americas. Well, land was free and cheap, sometimes both, or one or the other, and they were able to come in and buy hundreds of thousands of tracts of acres of land, build beautiful homes. But it wasn't 4 generations, maybe 3 generations later, that their children couldn't maintain the land. So what would happen is each one of the children, all the parcels would be divided when the death of the patriarch or matriarch dies, and they split it out. And then individually, those kids over the next 2 or 3 generations can't afford to keep their estates, and they continue to sell it out. Well, this is the reason why that a really smart economist, and for the life of me cannot remember his name, from the UK, said that the Torah, or the biblical prescription for land ownership, is a guarantee that keeps an individual from having all the wealth and land in the world, and people that used to have it dwindle down to nothing. It's like God's social justice. It's not some social justice been contrived by socialists and communists. It's one derived from the creator of the universe, who has a universal ethic that says that if this was an inheritance given to the children, then whatever happens, it needs to be returned back. It means that they should be able to have a way to pay or buy it back or redeem it, correct? Which is interesting, because the Levites, theirs was the only one that didn't need to be redeemed. It was just given back. I find that really interesting. Why? Because they didn't have land. So if for some reason they had to give up a house or a building, it would always go back to the Levites. He didn't have to redeem it that way. So this social economic upheaval or change was revolutionary. Why? Because the economy of that time was about slavery, or about people who sold themselves to an owner. Now, we've said this before, no one likes to talk about slavery as an economy, but we're not talking about slavery that we saw 200 years ago, 200 years ago, 250 years ago, or 200 years ago. The slavery of biblical times is employment. You used to work for Comcast, Xfinity Comcast. You were an indentured servant of Comcast. You had to work according to their corporate values. If you didn't, you would be punished for it, right? We don't like to think of ourselves as being a slave to a big corporation, but you are. And even if you work for yourself, you're now a slave to the public that you provide a product to. So with the idea of this is that the poor man who sold his inherited plot of land in his hour of need was to receive it back. The unfortunate convict who had been sold into slavery returns in that year to freedom and independence. But you find it interesting. There was no penal prisons. There was no prison set up. So that meant that you had to work off your debt to pay society. And your debt would be cleared at the sabbatical year. There's a limit to monopolization of commerce. That is, no corporate takeovers in the Messianic era, no corporate takeovers in Torah living. This is a limit. This is in our current corporate jargon, and the building of financial empires at the expense of others would not and is not part of the social system set up by the Creator. At least once in the life of every Jew living in the land of Israel can witness God's sovereign work over the land, man, and society. Think about this. Can you imagine living in a world in which a person who has developed his own wealth and somehow lost it because of unfortunate circumstances is restored? And everybody in the community gets to see that this man's life has been restored. There have been people whose lives have completely dismantled because of unfortunate circumstances, and it can be restored again. Many laws which govern the day-to-day administration of society stem from these fundamental concepts and limitations. Our parashot lists the prohibitions of fraud, for example, in verses 14 through 18. The commandment to redeem agricultural and urban property from a purchaser to restore it to its original owner, verse 25 through 34. Prohibitions against usury and interest, verse 35 and 38. Laws of defining various conditions of slavery, 39 through 54. All of these are explained more fully, and of course Talmudic literature, the national legal system of the peoples of Israel. Following the Jewish custom in Babylonia for reading the Torah on Shabbos, on the Sabbath, we divide the Torah into 54-week portions, each of these into 7 aliyot, or sub-portions, to be read in each by 7 men who are called up to the Torah in the synagogue. The sages who organize this weekly portion arrange the division in such a way that in many parashot, the central aliyah, the fourth in number, contains the main theological point of the parashah. In our parashah, Behar, the fourth aliyah tells of the commandment to support the right of every Jew to dwell in the land of his family. It's a right. Now, how in the world are we going to figure that out? Mashiach's going to have good bookkeeping. So what about all the lost tribes that return? You know, they're going to find out their ancestral land and be able to live in it. It's going to be an amazing thing. When any Jew who has fallen on hard times sells his land holdings, we are commanded to redeem the land on his behalf in order to make it possible. What incredible spiritual lesson does this tell us? Can you think of one? What lesson does this teach us that Hashem is showing us that here's your possession, and regardless of how you lost it, it's to be returned to you? What does that tell us about personal redemption? Personal worth. That God gave you, you were birthed into this world with a set of value, a purpose in life, and regardless of how you have spent it and maybe squandered it and messed it up, it is the Creator's intent for you to return to your original purpose. It is the Creator's intent to restore all things. And what I find in reading these things, even though none of these laws apply to us today, nor probably will apply to many people who are not Jewish in the day of Mashiach, is the idea that God is interested in you being restored back to your previous state. It's important for Him. And I don't believe that a person who cries out to Hashem to be restored is ever going to be ignored. It's not going to happen. Anybody that wants to be restored, Hashem will hear them and restore them back. Now, look at verse 23. It says, and here are two key verses about social morality. And the land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, for you were strangers and residents with me. Verse 55, you want to switch over to there, says, for the children of Israel are slaves to me. They are my slaves, whom I took out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. From these two verses, we may learn that man's freedom is born from his subservience to the Creator, blessed be He. While one who wishes to be free of the yoke of God ultimately falls under the yoke of his fellow man. Did you hear that? Anyone who chooses not to be a servant of the Creator of the universe will be a servant of someone else. Either your dad, Bob Dylan, yeah, Bob Dylan sang about that, right? You got to serve somebody. So the whole point is, you got to serve somebody. I would rather serve the Creator of the universe because He's just. He's full of mercy and compassion. He's full of loving kindness. Yes. Verse 23, for you are strangers and residents with me. Do, however, confront us with a problem of interpretation, since a stranger and a resident are not the same. A stranger has no rights in the land, whereas a resident certainly does. Chatam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, the 18th century, explained as follows. Anyone who considers himself the owner of the land and wishes to do with it as he sees fit will soon discover that he is only a stranger. Another spiritual lesson. You ready for the other spiritual lesson? Who do I belong to? Who do you belong to? The creator of the universe. And you can do whatever you want with this body. You have free choice, correct? You want to fill it with drugs, iniquity, whatever, bad food. One day you'll wake up on a hospital bed and realize, okay, I've made a mess and this ultimately belongs to God. And if I don't cry out for some help, there is no hope because I can make a wreck of it. The Creator wants you to understand that a big wise download that any individual can get is that none of us belong to ourselves. We all belong to the Creator. If we think we belong to our own self, we will one day wake up and realize we don't. And every human being finds that even to the point of their death. At some point you'll realize. Now the classic paradox in conclusion reflects the idea that a Jew is spared from subjugation to another or a society as a whole by being subjugated to he who spoke and created the world. Since the Almighty has prior ownership of every Israelite, every Jew, the land, the society, he places limitations on the extent in which any man can control another. Man's freedom and liberty are protected by his acceptance of the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. Now this is the great thing. All those in the righteous of the nations who've come down to realize, holy smoke, I know I'm not a Jew, but I am the possession of the creator of the universe. Anybody who accepts that upon themselves accepts the yoke of servitude. Anybody who says that the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of the Jewish people, is going to be my God, now is going to be able to experience the fringe benefits of yoking themselves to the creator of the universe. That's the beauty behind this whole thing. And it's not about a religion. It's not about taking upon yourself Judaism. It's about recognizing there is one God, there is no other God. There is only one law, and it is the law that was given to the Jewish people. Number two. Number three, if I recognize those things and I realize that I am not an island to myself, and I am also a unique person created in the image of God, I now have the privilege of having him protect me and restore me, and to also give me the opportunity to live within this society that is protected by the creator of the universe. That concludes this. Sure, we now go into Q&A and discussion of Bahar.